Hello students, with me Miss Yessica. So today we're going to start a new unit which is biodiversity, classification, and conservation. So firstly, we should know what's the meaning behind those words, right? So biodiversity means the variety and variability of life on Earth. Biodiversity is typically a measure of variations at the genetic, species, and ecosystem level. And then, what is classification? Classification means we are going to classify the organisms based on their similarities and differences. Conservation means the management of nature and of the earth biodiversity with the aim of protecting the species, their habitats, and ecosystems from the excessive rates of extinctions and erosions of biotic interactions. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin our lesson. Structures of biosphere. So, biosphere is a global ecological systems integrating all living beings and their relationship, including their interactions with the elements of the lithosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, and ionosphere. In biosphere, there is a hierarchy of organisms. So, the very first one should be the species, which is a group of organisms with similar morphology and psychology, which can breed together to produce the fertile offsprings and are reproductively isolated from other species. Then the next one after the species, it's the populations. It's the organisms of the same group or species who live in the particular geographical area and are capable of interbreeding. The next one after the population is the community. Community is a group or associations of populations of two or more different species occupying the same geographical area at the same time. Next is biome. It's a community of plants and animals that have the common characteristics for the environment they exist in. The next is the ecosystems, which is all of the living things, whether it's plants, animals, or organisms in a given area that interact with each other, as well as the non-living environments, which are weathers, earth, sun, soil, climate, atmosphere that surround the living things. And ecosystems is a relatively self-contained, interacting community of organisms and the environment in which they live and with which they interact. A various ecosystem includes not only the community of organisms, but also the soil, the dead leaves that form the leaves litter, water in the rain and the streams in the air, the rocks, and all the typical physical and chemical factors which influence the organisms. No ecosystems is entirely self-contained. Organisms in one ecosystem interact with those from others. Many birds, for example, migrate from one ecosystem to another, often over very great distances to find food and to breed. You can think that the ecosystems on the different scales. A small pond is an ecosystem as the water provides a very different environment from the soil and air around it. The organisms in the pond community are therefore very different from those of the surrounding ecosystems. At the other end of the scale is the open oceans, which is a huge ecosystems. Some ecosystems are very complex, such as the tropical rainforest and the coral reefs, and the other are very simple, such as the sandy desert. So, a habitat describes the place where a species lives within an ecosystems. The niche occupied by a species is more than a physical description of a place. Niche is the role of the organisms in the ecosystems. It is how the organism fits into the ecosystems. An organism's niche describes where it is, how it obtains the energy, how it interacts with both its physical environment and with other species. Organisms require resources from their surroundings and they have very special adaptations for obtaining them. In many ecosystems, there are similar niches that may be occupied by the same species or more likely by the different ones. In Australia, the niche of the large herbivores mammals is filled with the kangaroos. On the savanna of Africa, there are zebra, antelope, wild beasts, elephants, and many more species filling the large herbivore niche. They coexist because there are differences in such things as the type of vegetations that they eat. it is almost impossible to provide a complete description of the niche of any organisms because there are so many ways in which one organisms interact with other components of the ecosystem of which it is a part. We live in a time of great biodiversity, perhaps the greatest there has ever been in the history of the Earth. Tropical forests and coral reefs are the two of the most species-rich areas on the Earth. We also live in a time when our activities are causing severe problems for many ecosystems and driving the species to the extinctions. So, biodiversity can be defined as the degree variations of the life forms in an ecosystems. This is usually taken to include the diversity at three levels. Okay, one is the variations in the ecosystems or habitats. Two, it's the number of different species in the ecosystems and their relative abundance. Three, it's the genetic variations with each species. Species diversity. The number of the species in a community is known as the species richness. Species diversity takes species richness into account, but also includes a measure of evenness of the abundance of different species. The more species there are, the more evenly the number of organisms are distributed among the different species. It means that the greater the species diversity. Coral reefs have a very high biodiversity, such as an ecosystem covers many different ecological niches which are exploited by different species. Species diversity is considered important because ecosystems with a high species diversity tend to be more stable than ones with a limited diversity. They are more able to resist the changes. Some ecosystems are dominated by one or two species and other species may be rare. This is the case in the natural pine forest in Florida and temperate forests in Canada, which are dominated by the few tree species. The tropics are important centers of the biodiversity, possibly because living conditions are not too extreme or no frost, snow, or ice. There's a light or high intensity all year around. The birds and the mammals do not need to expend their energy keeping warm. For example, there are about 1,500 species of bird in Central America, but only 300 in the Northwest Territories of Canada. Genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is the diversity of alleles within the genes in the genome of a single species. All the individuals of the species have the same genes, but they do not have all the same alleles of those genes. Genetic diversity within the species can be assessed by finding out what proportions of genes have different alleles and how many alleles there are per gene. The genetic diversity that exists between the varieties of cultivated plants and domesticated animals is obvious because you can see the differences. Consider types of garden rose or breeds of dog. Similar genetic diversity, although not always obvious, exists in natural populations. The genetic differences between populations of the same species exist because populations may be adapted slightly different in different parts of their range. There's also genetic diversity within each population. This diversity is important because it's providing populations with the ability to adapt to the changes in abiotic and abiotic factors, such as the competition with other species, evading new predators, resisting new strains of disease, and changes in temperature, salinity, humidity, and rainfall. The next, it's about assessing species diversity. How we do that? Firstly, we need to collect the organisms and make the species list to find out the distributions and the abundance. The next one, you do the sampling. Okay, why do you do that is to find which species are present in ecosystems and the size of the populations of each of them. The ideal method will be to find, identify, and count every single organism that lives there. Sampling can be random or systematic. If an area looks reasonably uniform, or if there is no clear pattern to the way species are distributed, then it's best to use the random sampling. Biodiversity is under threat in many aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems as the human populations continues to increase and we take more resources from the environment and produce increasing quantities of waste. Ecosystems and species are being lost at the alarming rate, not just by the direct actions of humans, but also indirectly as a result of climate change. There are five major threats to the biodiversity, which are first, habitat loss and the degradations of the environment. Second is the climate change. Third is the excessive use of the fertilizers and industrial and domestic forms of pollution. Fourth is the over-exploitation and unsustainable use of resources. Then the last one is the effect of invasive alien species on the native species, especially the endemics. The destructions of natural environment leads to habitat loss. The clearing of land for the agriculture's housing, transport, leisure facilities, and industry removes vegetation. Consequently, many species of plant and animal either lose their habitats completely or their habitats become divided into small areas that is known as the habitat fragmentation. Most at the risks of the extinctions are endemic species on a small island. Deforestation has had a devastating effect on the biodiversity of some countries. Madagascar, famed for its unique plant and animal life, has lost almost all of its natural forests. Much of the forest in the northern hemisphere has been cleared by humans to grow food, a process that started about 10,000 years ago. Vast tracts of forests remained in the southern hemisphere until well into the 20th century, but much of those in the Southeast Asia, Africa, Amazonia, and Central America have now been cut down and have often been replaced with the cattle ranches and plantations of oil palm, which have much lower biodiversity. Deforestation can lead to severe land degradations as a result of soil erosion once the vegetation is removed. Although agriculture provides most of our food, we still rely on taking wild fish from the environment. It is very difficult to know whether the fish stocks are sustainable, but the history of the fishing industry suggests that many species have been driven to near extinctions by overfishing. Many fisheries, such as those for cod on the Grand Banks in the North Atlantic, herring in the North Sea, and a variety of species in the East China Sea, have declined or collapsed. The response to the steep decrease in large predatory species is to fish further down the food chains, taking smaller fish than the other animals, such as marine mammals and the seabirds depend upon. Fishing is just one example of overexploitation of resources. Another example is the removal of the logging companies of valuable trees such as teak, mahogany at a rate faster than they can regenerate. Pollution is a major threat to many ecosystems. In many countries, industrial and domestic waste is processed to reduce its impact on the environment. For example, the sewage is treated before it reaches the aquatic ecosystems such as rivers and the sea. Much toxic industrial waste is collected and disposed of so that it cannot leak into the environment. However, this does not happen everywhere, with the result that many ecosystems are polluted, often with the substances that animals' bodies are unable to metabolize or excrete. Polychlorinated biphenyls were used in various manufacturing processes. Waste from the factories used to flow directly into the rivers without any form of treatment. Even though the polychlorinated biphenyls, or we call it as PCB, are no longer used, the substance persists in the environment and has entered the food chain. Among its effects are weakening of immune systems and reductions in fertility in birds and mammals. PCBs were one of the factors contributing to the deaths of the seals in the North Sea from the viral infections. Non-biodegradable plastics is a major marine pollutant. Animals such as dolphins and turtles get caught in the discarded fishing nets and die. Turtles eat plastic bags, making them for the jellyfish. Much of the world's farmland is in low-lying land near coasts. Fertilizers that have not being absorbed by the crop plants drain into the rivers and then into the sea. The extra nutrients that become available to the river and the marine ecosystem cause the growth of the producers such as the algae. This often occurs faster than the herbivorous organisms such as fish can feed on them to keep their growth under control. Many of these algae produce toxic substances and their growth often unbalances food webs. Excess growth of algae has catastrophic effects on coral reefs and hugely reduces the biodiversity. Pollution of the air leads to the problem for the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. The combustion fuels with a high sulfur content, such as the coal, leads to the high concentration of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. This reacts with the water vapor to fall as acid rain. Acid rain has destroyed vegetation and led to the acidification of aquatic ecosystems in parts of the world downwind of the highly industrialized areas. Few animals can survive and/or breed in the waters of low pH, so the biodiversity has decreased markedly. Many ecosystems are still at risk from the acid rain. Industrialization and the extractions and combustions of the fossil fuels have also led to the increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere. These are both greenhouse gases. High emissions of the methane are associated with the cattle and the rice farming and the breakdown under the anaerobic conditions of organic waste in the landfill sites. The build-up of the greenhouse gases is leading to the climate change. Global warming is likely to produce changes in the distributions of terrestrial ecosystems. Organisms are expected to migrate north or south to cooler latitudes and also to the higher altitudes. There will be competition between the migrating organisms and species in existing communities. The acidifications of the oceans may spell catastrophe for the coral reefs and those species such as the many mollusks. They are very sensitive to the temperatures increases. The algae that live inside the polyps tend to leave the animals if the temperatures remain high for a period of time. This leads to the coral turning white. Coral bleaching, as it is called, can lead to the death of the coral. Coral reefs are one of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. We rely on them to provide the protections for many coastlines. A large proportion of coral reefs have already been destroyed and degraded by overfishing, mining, and fertilizers runoff. The rise in the sea levels associated with the global warming will bring many problems for the coastal ecosystem, which are some of the most productive on the Earth. Some ecosystems will become even more restricted in their range than is currently in case, and some will become even more fragmented. For example, ecosystems associated with the high altitude will retreat higher up mountains. As the world warms, where will they go then? The frequency of natural catastrophes such as the hurricanes, typhoons, severe storms, and flooding is thought to be an increase. Following the typhoons in the Pacific, flooding increases the concentrations of the nutrients in the coastal waters. This encourages the growth of the phytoplankton, which provides food for the larvae of the crown of thorn starfish. Huge number of the adults then eat the coral. Eventually, the numbers of the starfish decrease and the coral regrows. If these population explosions happen every 10 years or so, the coral has time to recover. If they are more frequent than this, then it might not. Protecting endangered species. There are a variety of ways to protect the endangered species. The best way to conserve any species is to keep it in its natural habitat. Maintaining the natural habitat means that all the life support systems are provided. Okay, there are 3 ways, which are national parks, zoos, and the botanic gardens. The first one is the national parks. National parks have the restricted access to the uninhabited island and limited access to the other areas which are sensitive to the human interference. Alien animal species such as the rats and goats are being removed, and invasive plants such as the elephant grass dug up and destroyed. There are captive breeding and reintroductions programs. There are restrictions on human activities in national parks. Tourism brings in money to pay for the maintenance of the parks and also helps to inform people about how conservation takes place. Zoos. Zoos have a variety of functions in addition to providing enjoyment and interest for visitors who can see and study the animals that they would not otherwise be able to see. Zoos provide protections for endangered and vulnerable species and have had success with captive breeding programs, often with the long-term aim of reintroducing the animals to their natural habitat. Zoos also have an important role in research, especially in trying to gain a better understanding of breeding habits, habitat requirements, and ways to increase the genetic diversity. The third one, botanic gardens. Botanic gardens play similar roles to the zoo for endangered plants. Seed or cuttings are collected from the species in the wild and then used to build up a population of plants from which one day some plants may be reintroduced to their natural habitats. The roles of botanic gardens are two. First, to protect the endangered plant species. Second, it's the research methods of reproductions and growth so that the species cultivated in the botanic gardens can be grown in appropriate conditions and be propagated. Third, research conservation methods so the plants can be introduced to the new habitats if their original habitat has been destroyed. Fourth, reintroduce the species to the habitats where they have become very rare or extinct. And the last one is to educate the public in the many roles of the plants in ecosystems and their economic value. International conservation organizations. So there are two so far. The first one is the CITES, also known as the Conventions on International Trade in Endangered Species and Wild Flora and Fauna. The purpose of this organization is to control the trade in the endangered species and any products from them, such as the fur, skins, and ivory. The second one is the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF. The WWF is the largest international non-governmental organization, or NGO, specializing in conservation. Its mission statement is to stop the degradations of the planet's natural environment and to build features in which the humans live in harmony with the nature. To this end, it funds conservation projects, publicizes the environmental issues, and campaigns to save the ecosystems from degradations and species from extinctions. I think that's all for our lesson today. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.